Tell him the truth. That baby cannot be his.
If that child is mine, why did you hide it from me?
The fluorescent lights of Seoul National Hospital's delivery wing had never felt so brutal. They buzzed and flickered overhead like something alive, casting a cold, merciless glow across the corridor where nurses moved fast and nobody smiled. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air so thick you could almost taste it. Somewhere behind a closed door, a woman screamed, not in pain, but in the particular, soul-splitting agony of a body doing what it was made to do while the heart inside it was completely, utterly broken. That woman was Mary Itodo, 26 years old, Nigerian, alone in a city of 10 million people, and about to give birth to a secret she had carried longer than the child itself. The delivery room door burst open so hard it slammed against the wall. Kang Min-Jae stood in the doorway. He was wearing a charcoal suit, no tie, the top button of his white shirt undone. As if he had dressed in a hurry. As if someone had called him and he had run. His jaw was tight. His eyes, those impossible dark eyes that Mary had spent 6 months trying to forget, swept the room until they found her. And when they did, something moved across his face. Something that had no name in any of the 4 languages Mary spoke. Mary. His voice was low, controlled. But his hands were shaking. A nurse stepped forward immediately. Sir, you cannot be in here. That is my name on the room. His voice did not rise. It never did. But the nurse stepped back anyway, because there are certain men in Seoul whose voices do not need volume to command a room. Kang Min-Jae was one of them. Mary turned her face away. She was gripping the bed rail with both hands. Her knuckles dark against the steel, her breathing coming in waves. She had not called him. She had not told anyone who could reach him. For 6 months she had been so careful, so deliberate, so ruthlessly committed to keeping this secret locked behind her teeth. And yet here he was. Here he was, standing 6 feet from her bed, looking at her with an expression she could not read and could not afford to feel. Mary. His voice broke on the second syllable. Just barely. Just enough. Look at me. She could not. And then the sound came from the corridor. Heels. Fast, sharp, decisive. The sound of a woman who had never once in her life walked into a room unsure of herself. Han Soo-jin appeared in the doorway. She was stunning in the way a blade is stunning, precise and cold and designed entirely to cut. Her silk blouse was ivory. Her hair was perfect. And her eyes, when they found Mary on that hospital bed, went very, very still. Tell him. Her voice was quiet. Surgical. Tell him the truth, Mary. Tell him right now. She took 1 step into the room. That baby cannot be his. The doctor looked up from his chart. A nurse stopped moving. The monitoring machine kept beeping. Beep, beep, beep. Indifferent and mechanical. The only sound in a room where every human being had stopped breathing. Min-Jae did not look at Soo-jin. He had not looked at her once. His eyes stayed on Mary, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet it was almost gentle, which was somehow worse than if he had shouted. If that child is mine, he said slowly. Why did you hide it from me? Mary squeezed her eyes shut. 1 tear escaped. Then another. She pressed her lips together so hard they went white. The monitor spiked. A contraction hit her like a wave from the inside. And she cried out, a raw, broken sound. And in the half-second that followed, Min-Jae crossed the room in 3 steps, his hand reaching for hers without thinking. Instinct overriding everything, and Soo-jin shouted his name from the doorway. And a nurse shouted for everyone to leave, and Mary. Cut. 6 months earlier. If you are new here, welcome. Subscribe to Oyinelle AfroKorean Romance right now and drop your country in the comments. We want to know exactly where in the world this story is reaching. And keep watching, because what you just saw is only the beginning, and you are not prepared for how we got there. The thing about Seoul in spring is that it lies to you. The cherry blossoms come out pink and soft and ridiculous, coating the streets of Gangnam in a kind of beauty that feels almost manufactured, almost too deliberate, like the city dressed itself up in its finest clothes to make a good impression. And if you are Mary Itodo, arriving in this city for the first time with 2 suitcases, a certification in Korean and French translation, and approximately 4 months of rent money left in your account, that beauty hits you in a specific, almost cruel way. Because beautiful things have a way of making you feel how far away from home you are. Mary had grown up in Abuja. She had studied linguistics at the University of Lagos, then spent 2 years in Paris on a scholarship that changed the shape of her ambition. Languages had always come to her the way water comes to certain landscapes, naturally, inevitably, without effort. By the time she was 24, she spoke Yoruba, Igbo, English, French, and Korean with enough fluency that she could dream in all 5. She was the kind of person that institutions wanted to hire, and then spent years failing to properly value, which is perhaps the most specific and exhausting kind of talent to carry. She had landed the position at Min-Jae Group through an international recruitment agency, translator and communications assistant, Gangnam headquarters. The contract said the internship was paid. The reality was that her stipend was so small it barely covered her half of a shared apartment in Mapo that she split with a woman named Aiko who worked nights and slept days and never once complained about anything, which Mary found both admirable and slightly terrifying. The money she had left after rent went home to her mother in Abuja, who was raising Mary's 2 younger siblings on a teacher's salary that the government paid sometimes and sometimes forgot to pay at all. Every month Mary performed a small private miracle of mathematics, stretching what remained of her stipend across food and transport, and the occasional luxury of a warm meal that wasn't instant noodles. And she did it without complaint because complaining required energy she could not afford. Min-Jae Group was one of the largest conglomerates in South Korea. It had interests in shipping, technology, luxury hospitality, and a pharmaceuticals division that had recently expanded into West Africa. The Gangnam headquarters was 42 floors of glass and ambition, the kind of building that communicated power so efficiently that most people felt slightly smaller the moment they walked through its doors. Mary had learned in her first week to walk through those doors as if the building had been waiting for her specifically. It helped. Marginally. The translation department was on the 19th floor and was run by a team leader named Park Ji-won, who was efficient, humorless, and had a very specific and persistent way of mispronouncing Mary's name that Mary was 90% certain was deliberate. The department was predominantly Korean, with 2 Japanese colleagues and 1 German woman named Petra, who had been there for 7 years, and had the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had survived many things. Mary's co-workers were not unkind in the way that people are cruel. They were unkind in the way that people are indifferent. A colder, more deniable variety of dismissal. They left her out of lunch invitations not by telling her she couldn't come, but simply by not mentioning they were going. They spoke Korean around her at a pace they knew she could not follow without effort, and then looked mildly surprised when she kept up. They submitted her translations for review by Ji-won without crediting her, and Ji-won accepted them without correcting the record. Mary kept her head down and her translations flawless and her feelings strictly off the premises. She had been there for 2 months when the night in question happened. It was a Thursday. She knew it was a Thursday because the office cleaner always brought his daughter on Thursdays. A tiny girl in red boots who sat quietly in the corner of the lobby and drew pictures in a notebook, and Mary always brought her a small snack from the convenience store downstairs. That particular Thursday she had stayed past 9, finishing an urgent contract translation for a deal between Min-Jae Group and a Moroccan shipping company. The corridor outside the translation department was empty, the overhead lights in energy-saving mode, casting the hallway in a dim, institutional half-dark. She was packing her bag when she heard them. 2 voices. Male. Recognizable. Both from the business development team. Both people who had never once acknowledged her existence in the 2 months she had worked there. She heard her name first, which is the way you always hear your own name, even across distances, even through walls. The African girl. One of them said. And then something in Korean, low and laughing. The other one responded. More laughter. A word she recognized. And then another, and then a phrase she understood completely. Her Korean was good enough for that. Good enough to catch the full contempt of it. The easy cruelty of people who say things they would deny saying the moment anyone important walked through the door. Mary stood very still. Her bag strap was in her hand. Her face did the thing her face had learned to do in Paris. And before that in Lagos, and probably before that in 100 smaller rooms, it went neutral. Smooth. Untouchable. The expression of a woman who has practiced, very carefully, The art of not letting people see where they have landed. If her work is so good, the first voice continued in Korean, why doesn't she go be brilliant back in Africa? Because Kang Min-Jae apparently has a taste for. Enough. The word came from the end of the corridor. Quiet. Unhurried. And so immediately, completely authoritative that both voices stopped as if cut with a blade. Kang Min-Jae walked out of the shadows of the hallway with the specific, measured calm of a man who has never once in his life needed to rush to make a point. He was 32. He was the heir to everything that building represented. And he wore that fact the way some men wear expensive watches. Not to show it, but because it had long since become simply part of how he moved through the world. He looked at the two men in business development the way a person looks at something mildly disappointing. Not angry, just conclusive. If you cannot respect talent, he said, you do not deserve to work here. Silence. He did not wait for a response. He looked down the corridor toward the translation department, and his eyes found Mary standing in the dim light by the door with her bag in her hand, and her face doing the thing her face did. He held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and was gone. Neither man in business development said another word. One of them left the building that night and submitted his resignation by email the following morning. Mary only found this out later. In the moment, she stood in the hallway for a long time after everyone had gone, bag strap in her hand, heart doing something complicated and involuntary in her chest, and told herself firmly that it meant nothing. She told herself that for several weeks. The first time Min-Jae requested her specifically, the department assumed it was an error. Ji-won called Mary into her office with the expression of someone delivering mildly confusing news. The CEO's office has requested you for the Dakar preparatory meeting, she said. As primary interpreter. Mary waited. It's probably a mistake, Ji-won added. It was not a mistake. The Dakar meeting was a pre-negotiation session with representatives from a Senegalese government infrastructure ministry, 3 officials whose French was formal and regional, and layered with political subtext that required not just fluency, but actual comprehension of West African diplomatic culture. Min-Jae's usual international team had fumbled a previous meeting with a different West African delegation badly enough that the partnership had nearly collapsed. Somebody, Mary later suspected it was his chief of staff, had read her employment file carefully and flagged her specific combination of qualifications. She walked into the 40th floor conference room at 9 in the morning and did not let herself be impressed by it, because she had decided before leaving her apartment that she was going to be exactly as competent in that room as she was on the 19th floor, and being impressed by the room was counterproductive to that goal. Min-Jae was already there. He looked up when she entered, acknowledged her with a nod, and returned to the briefing document in front of him. She sat in the interpreter's chair beside him and prepared her notes. The meeting lasted 3 hours. It was dense, technical, and politically delicate in ways that required her to make micro-decisions about word choice every few minutes, which French phrase carried the right level of formality, which Korean business term translated in a way the Senegalese officials would find respectful rather than condescending, where to soften and where to let the sharpness of a statement land. She navigated all of it without error, without hesitation, and without once drawing attention to the fact that she was doing something difficult. At one point, 40 minutes in, a member of Min-Jae's legal team passed him a translated paragraph from the proposed memorandum. Min-Jae read it, frowned slightly, and slid it across to Mary without comment. She read it. There was a translation error in the 3rd sentence. A mistranslation of a legal term that would have implied a liability clause the Korean side had specifically negotiated out of the agreement. It was the kind of mistake that would have been invisible to everyone in the room except her, and eventually, the lawyers who reviewed the final document. She wrote the correct translation in the margin in her precise, small handwriting and slid it back. He read her correction. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. A quiet reevaluation. He looked at her sideways for a moment. The way you look at something you thought you understood and have just realized you did not. He did not say anything then. After the meeting, when the Senegalese officials had been escorted to lunch and the legal team had dispersed, he stopped beside her chair while she was gathering her materials. That correction, he said. The liability clause. The original translation would have reinstated terms that your legal team spent 2 rounds of negotiation removing, she said, not looking up from her notepad. I assumed that was not your intention. A pause. You assumed correctly. She looked up then. He was watching her with that same quality of attention, focused, unreadable, genuinely considering. It was not the way men in that building usually looked at her. It was not the usual mixture of dismissal and mild curiosity. It was the way someone looks when they are actually paying attention. And it was somewhat more unsettling than the alternative. Thank you, he said. Simple. Direct. Like he meant it. She nodded and went back to the 19th floor. Ji-won requested Mary for every international meeting after that. Or rather, Min-Jae's office requested Mary, and Ji-won passed the message along with a carefully neutral face that communicated several feelings she was choosing not to express. Rumors started on the 19th floor first and spread upward. Mary heard them the same way she heard most things in that building, through the gap between what people said and what they said when they thought she wasn't listening. She ignored them efficiently, filed them under irrelevant, and continued doing her job at the same standard she always had, because her work was the one thing in Seoul that was entirely hers and she refused to let it be contaminated by other people's stories about her. What she could not ignore, what she was honest enough with herself, in the privacy of her apartment, to acknowledge, was the way she had started to notice him. Not in the way the rumors suggested. Not in any way she would have admitted to anyone, including herself in broad daylight. But in the late-night meetings when it was just the two of them and a document and the particular silence of an empty office, she noticed that he was different from what she had expected. He had a precision about him that was almost artistic. The way he constructed an argument, the way he listened without fidgeting, the way he could sit completely still for long periods and simply think. He was not warm, exactly. But he was real in a way that a lot of people in that building were not. And she found herself, against every instinct of self-preservation, finding that interesting. And then she found out about Soo-jin. It was Petra who told her, in the matter-of-fact way of someone delivering information they assume everyone already has. The engagement announcement is in this week's business supplement, Petra said, sliding the magazine across the break room table. Han So-yin. Her family has the 3rd largest shipping fleet in Korea. They've been engaged for about a year. Wedding is expected before year-end. Mary looked at the photograph. Soo-jin was beautiful. Organized-looking. The kind of beauty that comes from structure and intention. She was standing beside Min-Jae at some charity event, her hand on his arm, and he was looking at the camera with his usual unreadable composure. Ah, said Mary. Did you not know? Petra watched her. Why would I know? Mary said. She handed the magazine back and took her coffee to her desk. She sat down. She opened her translation software. She began working. That evening, in her apartment in Mapo, she had a very direct conversation with herself about the nature of what she had been feeling and the precise, non-negotiable reasons why she was going to stop feeling it immediately. She was practical. She was disciplined. She had crossed an ocean alone and built a life out of talent and refusal, and she was not going to compromise any of that over a man who was already spoken for, and who lived in a world so far removed from hers that the distance wasn't even metaphorical. It was structural, financial, architectural, cultural. She made her decision. She was efficient about it. She was wrong. The night by the Han River happened on a Friday, after a reception for a visiting European trade delegation that had gone 40 minutes overtime, and ended with a minor diplomatic crisis, involving a mistranslated toast, that Mary had spent 25 minutes resolving through a combination of linguistic precision and the particular grace of someone who knows how to make everyone in a room feel slightly better than they actually deserve to. She was exhausted in a specific, deep way that went past her body into something closer to her core. She had walked without thinking, following the pull of the river the way people in cities follow water when they need something they cannot name. She found a stone bench on the walkway above the Han and sat down and looked at Seoul reflecting itself on the water's surface. All those lights breaking apart and reassembling in the slow current. And let herself, for exactly as long as she needed to, be tired. She did not hear him approach. He was quiet that way. You resolved the Beaumont situation, he said, from a few feet away. She did not startle. She was too tired to startle. The ambassador had been toasting South Korean innovation. Your interpretation team gave the French delegation a version that implied Korea was innovating in ways that made France obsolete. I adjusted it. To what? A toast to complementary excellence. She paused. They seemed pleased. He was quiet for a moment. Then instead of leaving, which was what she expected, what made sense, what fit the version of him she had been carefully maintaining in her mind as a corrective measure, he sat down. Not beside her. A respectful distance. But he sat, which was unexpected enough that she looked at him sideways. He had loosened his tie. He was looking at the river with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something unguarded, something that belonged to a private person rather than a public one. It was startling, like watching a building drop its facade. These events, he said after a while, they are a specific kind of performance. Yes. She understood exactly what he meant. Do you find them exhausting? She considered lying. Always, she said. He nodded. And then, quietly, in a voice that seemed to surprise even him. Sometimes power feels like a prison. She looked at him fully then. He was not asking for sympathy. He was not performing vulnerability. He was simply saying a true thing, out loud, to a person he had perhaps decided, for reasons she did not yet understand, was safe enough to say it to. She thought about his 42-floor building, about the engagement announcement in the business supplement, about the way he carried himself in rooms where everyone was watching him and nobody was actually seeing him. Then why don't you escape it? She said quietly. He turned to look at her. Their eyes held. The city glittered behind him. Where would I go? He asked. Anywhere, she said. Everywhere. She paused. I left everything I knew to come here. It was terrifying. But I found out I was capable of more than I knew. Something in his expression shifted. An opening, small, barely perceptible. Like a door moving an inch in a building that doesn't have doors. The rain started without warning, the way Seoul rain sometimes does. No build-up, no courtesy, just suddenly the sky deciding. They were both soaked within 30 seconds and it was absurd. The two of them sitting on a stone bench in the rain. A billionaire and a translation in turn. Equalized by weather in a way that nothing else could have achieved. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. And it rewrote everything she thought she understood about his face. She laughed too. And for a few minutes they were just two people in the rain by the Han River, laughing at the ridiculousness of being human in a city that mostly doesn't notice you. Then the laughter faded and something else remained. And they were very close. And his eyes found hers in the rain with a question in them. And she answered it without speaking, and she knew. She knew even in that moment, that she was making a decision she could not unmake. He kissed her in the rain beside the Han River on a Friday night in April. One kiss became two. Two became the taxi. The taxi became his apartment. Not the corporate one, he said, the real one. The one in Itaewon that nobody knew about. And she understood that she was being given something private. Something that existed outside the building and the title and the engagement announcement in the business supplement. They talked until 3 in the morning and then they stopped talking. And for one night, she let herself be with him in the way she had been denying herself since the evening in the corridor. And it was not careful or guarded or managed. It was real. It was the most real thing that had happened to her since she crossed the ocean. She woke at 6. The apartment was quiet and blue with early light, and she was alone. There was no note. There was coffee prepared, sitting on the kitchen counter, still warm, which meant he hadn't been gone long. But he was gone. She sat up, and the covers fell. And she sat in that blue morning light and understood the coffee for what it was. A consideration. A kindness. And a conclusion. She dressed quickly. She left without touching the coffee. She took the subway home and stood in the packed morning car holding the overhead rail, surrounded by strangers, and kept her face doing the thing her face did. She was fine. She was very good at being fine. 3 days later, she opened her phone during her lunch break, and the news was everywhere. Business headlines. Social media. The digital billboard she could see from the translation department window. Kang Min-Jae and Han Seojin confirm wedding date. The date was 3 months away. She stared at it. She read it again. And then she did something she had not let herself do since she was 20 years old, and her scholarship to Paris had almost fallen through, and she had sat in a bathroom stall at university, and allowed herself exactly 2 minutes of terror before pulling herself back together. She went to the bathroom. She went into a stall. She sat down on the closed lid and she cried, silently, efficiently, completely, for 2 minutes. Then she pulled herself back together. She went back to her desk. She typed her resignation letter. She submitted it to Ji-won that afternoon, citing personal reasons, effective immediately, which Ji-won received with an expression of unsurprised resignation, which told Mary more than she wanted to know about what Ji-won had understood about the situation. She was out of the building by 6. She did not look back. Itaewon was different from Gangnam in the way that reality is different from a brochure. It was noisier, messier, more alive, layered with the voices and smells and textures of people from everywhere. Nigerians, Ghanaians, Pakistanis, Americans, French, Japanese, all colliding and overlapping in the narrow streets that climbed the hill from the main road. Mary found a room in a shared apartment above a fabric shop, paid for 3 months up front, and began the work of disappearing into the neighborhood the way immigrants have always disappeared into enclaves, by becoming necessary. She found work at a restaurant run by a man from Imo State named Chukwemeka, who everyone called Chinidu, who had been in Seoul for 9 years and had the comfortable authority of someone who has learned a city's rhythms thoroughly enough to bend them slightly to his own purposes. He was 40, broad-shouldered, perpetually cooking, and possessed of the specific wisdom that comes from having survived many things in a country that was not designed with you in mind. He hired her to manage the front of house and handle the restaurant's increasingly complicated administrative requirements, which included a licensing issue with the district office that required somebody who could argue persuasively in Korean, and several import documentation problems that required somebody who could read French customs forms. She resolved both within her first week. Chinita looked at her with new respect, and began paying her slightly more than the rate they'd agreed. She was building again. She was always building. She told herself she was fine. She was 3 weeks in when the nausea started. At first she explained it the way you explain inconvenient things: exhaustion, stress, the change in diet, the particular humidity of Seoul in May. She was disciplined about explanations. She had an explanation for everything. But the nausea did not respond to explanations, or to the ginger tea she drank every morning, or to the particular mental firmness with which she approached her days. At 5 weeks she bought a test from the pharmacy on the corner, because she was a practical person and practical people address possibilities directly rather than avoiding them. She sat on the bathroom floor of the apartment above the fabric shop, and looked at the result for a very long time. Then she made an appointment at the nearest clinic. The doctor was a woman in her 50s with a calm, unhurried manner, and reading glasses on a beaded chain. She confirmed the test. She performed the necessary examination. She looked up over her glasses with an expression of genuine warmth. "Congratulations," she said. "You are approximately 8 weeks pregnant." The word congratulations landed in Mary's chest like something thrown. She sat with it. 8 weeks. Which meant the Han River, and the rain, and the one night she had been real. She left the clinic. She stood on the pavement outside with the appointment card in her hand and the city moving around her, and she allowed herself to feel, in sequence very briefly, shock, terror, grief, and then something else. Something quieter and more complicated. Something that did not have a simple name. She called Min-Jae's number from memory, because she had not let herself save it in her phone, and she had not let herself forget it either. A man answered. His assistant. "I need to speak with Kang Min-Jae," she said in Korean. "Mr. Kang is unavailable. May I ask who's calling?" "Mary Itodo." I worked in the translation department. It's important." A brief pause. "I'm sorry, Mr. Kang is not accepting calls from." "Please tell him." "Miss Itodo." The assistant's voice was very polite and very final. "Mr. Kang is in pre-wedding preparations. He cannot be disturbed. If you have a work-related query, please contact the HR department." The line went quiet. She stood there on the pavement for another full minute. Then she put her phone in her pocket and walked back to Itaewon. That evening she told Chinidu. Not all of it. Enough. He listened without interruption, which she had come to understand was one of his most valuable qualities, and then he made 2 cups of tea and said, "You are not alone. You understand that? You are not alone." She nodded. "What are you going to do?" he asked. She wrapped both hands around the mug. She thought about Min-Jae's wedding announcement, about the assistant's polite, conclusive voice, about the appointment card still in her jacket pocket. "I am going to have this baby," she said. "And he is never going to know." Itodo looked at her for a long time. He had the expression of someone who understood exactly what a decision like that cost, and had enough respect for her to not argue with it. "Okay," he said. "Then we make a plan." 2 miles away and 40 floors up, Kang Min-Jae was standing at the window of his office. He did not know yet, but something was wrong, and he felt it in the particular way that people who are very attuned to systems feel when a variable has disappeared without resolution. He had looked for her. Not immediately. That took weeks of not being able to stop thinking about the Han River, about her voice saying, "Then why don't you escape it?" About waking at 6 and making coffee. He hadn't been there to see her leave without drinking. He had finally asked Ji-won on the 19th floor, with the careful indirection of a man who was accustomed to getting information without revealing why he wanted it. "Mary Itodo resigned," Ji-won said. "About 4 weeks ago. Personal reasons." He absorbed this. "Do you have contact information?" Ji-won gave him what HR had on file. An email address that bounced, a phone number that rang without answer, an address in Mapo that turned out to be a sublet whose new occupant had never heard of any Nigerian woman. She had vanished. He stood at the window and looked at Gangnam, all that glass and intention, and tried to identify what he was feeling, which was something he was generally poor at, having spent 32 years in an environment where feelings were primarily useful as information about what decisions needed to be made. He was feeling loss. That was new. He had meetings. He had a wedding to organize. He had a company with 17,000 employees and a West Africa expansion that was entering a delicate phase, and a father with a heart condition who had opinions about everything. He had a life that was extremely fully scheduled. He stood at the window and looked at Gangnam, and felt the loss of a woman he had spent one night with by the Han River, and could not resolve it. And this failure of resolution was itself unusual enough to be alarming. "Find her," he told his chief of staff the next morning. "Who?" "Mary Itodo. Former employee. Translation department." He did not elaborate. "Find her." His chief of staff, a man named Kim Soo-hyun who had been with the family for 11 years and had learned to fulfill unusual requests without requiring explanations, said simply, "Yes, sir," and left. He did not find her. Itaewon is a very good place to disappear into if you know how, and Mary had spent 2 months learning exactly how. What Soo-jin noticed was simpler and more dangerous. She noticed that Min-Jae had begun looking for someone. She did not know who. She was not told. But she had known Min-Jae for 3 years, and she understood the specific quality of his distraction. The way he checked his phone without registering what he saw. The way he sat through their wedding planning sessions with a politeness that had calcified into something she could not reach through. She had married into this arrangement with her eyes open. The Han family and the Kang family had been aligning this match for years. It was not a love story, and it had never been presented as one. But Soo-jin was not incapable of wanting things. And what she wanted, among other things, was Min-Jae's actual attention. And something had taken it. She hired a private investigator on a Tuesday. She told him to start with the translation department. Back in Itaewon, Mary was 6 months along and carrying her secret the way she carried everything, with discipline and grace, and the specific determination of a woman who has decided that what she is doing is right, and is going to continue doing it regardless of what it costs. She was beautiful in her pregnancy in the way some women are. Not comfortable, not peaceful, but radiant in a difficult, searching way. Chanida's restaurant had become her world in miniature. She managed the books, handled the licensing disputes, translated documents that came in from suppliers in Lagos and Lyon and Accra, and ate her dinner at the staff table every night while Chanidu argued with his cook about seasoning in a mix of Yoruba and Korean that had become its own specific dialect of that kitchen. She called her mother every Sunday. Her mother did not know yet. This was a separate arithmetic of secrecy, its own ongoing calculation. She would tell her. She just needed to figure out, first, how the story went after the part where she told it. She was serving lunch on a Tuesday in late October when the room tilted. It happened fast, a sudden vertiginous wave of dizziness, the kind that doesn't give you time to prepare, followed by a pain below her ribs that was sharp and wrong in a way that was different from the ordinary architecture of pregnancy discomfort. She caught herself on the counter. Someone said her name. The room tilted again. She woke up on the floor with Chinita's face above her, his hand on her shoulder, his voice very controlled and very frightened, saying her name in the particular way people say names when they are trying to call someone back from somewhere far. "I'm here," she said. "You went down. You were out for a minute. I'm calling the ambulance." "I've fine." "Mary." His voice was quiet and final. "You are not fine. And I cannot decide that for you about yourself. But I can decide it about my restaurant floor, where you are currently lying. I am calling the ambulance." She stopped arguing. The ambulance came. She was put in it. Chinita rode with her, one large hand over hers the whole way, which she was more grateful for than she was willing to say. Seoul National Hospital was 20 minutes through the late afternoon traffic. She was registered. She was taken to a room. She was examined by a doctor who told her that her blood pressure had spiked dangerously, that she had been overdoing it, that she needed rest, serious rest, not the performative version, and that the baby was fine. The baby's heartbeat was strong, but the mother was running on reserves she could not afford to keep spending. She lay back against the pillow and closed her eyes and let herself, just for a moment, be exhausted. Kang Min-Jae was on the 4th floor of the same hospital. His father had been admitted the previous week for a cardiac evaluation. Nothing catastrophic, a precaution, the kind of thing that happens when you are 71 and have spent 50 years running an empire at the pace of someone who believes rest is for the period after death. Min-Jae had been coming every evening. He sat with his father for an hour, navigated the careful, affectionate tension of their relationship. A father who had given his son everything except the permission to want something the father hadn't chosen. And then walked the long corridor to the elevator with the specific heaviness of a man carrying obligations that were beginning to feel like architecture, structural and inescapable. He was in that corridor. He was walking toward the elevator. And he heard a nurse, a young woman with a green lanyard, talking to another nurse at the station, say something that stopped him mid-stride. The pregnant woman in 412. Foreign. Severe stress response, blood pressure crisis. Poor thing was brought in from a restaurant in Itaewon. He had already passed the station. He took 3 more steps. Doctor says the baby is fine. She kept saying she was fine. These women. A pause, affectionate rather than dismissive. They pushed themselves too hard. He stood still in the corridor. Itaewon. The word sat in him. He turned around. He walked back past the nurse's station, around the corner, down the corridor to the room numbered 412. He did not ask for permission. He did not run. He walked with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who is managing something rising inside him that he does not entirely trust himself to manage faster than that. He stopped outside the door. He put his hand on it. He pushed it open. The room was ordinary, the particular institutional ordinariness of hospital rooms everywhere, white walls and vinyl floor, and the metronomic sound of a monitoring machine. There was a chair by the window where Chinita sat, his large frame slightly too big for it, a paper cup of coffee in his hands. And on the bed, propped against the raised pillow, very clearly pregnant, her eyes closed, her hands folded over her stomach. Mary. He could not speak for a moment. He managed finally, barely above a whisper. Mary. Her eyes opened. She went still in the way that people go still when they see the one thing they have been, for months, architecturally arranging their entire lives to avoid. She opened her mouth. Nothing came. Chinita stood up from his chair. He looked between them with the expression of a man rapidly assembling a picture he had not previously had all the pieces of. Min-Jae stepped into the room. His eyes went to her stomach, and something happened to his face. Something that had no name in any of the 4 languages Mary spoke, something that was shock and recognition and a vast, arriving understanding all at once. He took another step, and the door burst open behind him. Sujin walked in like a weather system, controlled and violent and precisely aimed. Behind her were two people. A man in a dark jacket who was clearly the investigator, and a woman in a clinic uniform who was holding a manila envelope. Sujin's eyes found Mary on the bed. Her jaw set. She crossed the room in 5 steps and threw the manila envelope onto the bed in front of Mary. Papers slid out. A form with a clinic letterhead. Numbers. Percentages. A result line. Ask her, Sujin said to Min-Jae, her voice so controlled it was almost pleasant. Ask her whose baby she is carrying. Min-Jae did not look at the papers. He did not look at Sujin. He was looking at Mary. The doctor, a quiet man in his 50s who had been standing against the far wall since Sujin's entrance with the expression of someone who had seen many unusual things in this profession, but was nonetheless finding this particular one quite remarkable, picked up the paper that had fallen nearest to him. He read it quietly. He set it down. He said, "The paternity result indicates that the father is Kang Min-Jae." The room went silent. Not the ordinary silence of an empty space. The specific, pressurized silence of a room full of people who are each, in their own way, rearranging everything they thought they knew. Sujin's composure broke. Not in a collapse. Not in tears, but in the sharp, bright fracture of a person who has been holding something very tightly for a very long time, and has now received confirmation of exactly what they feared. She turned to Min-Jae and her voice, when it came, was raw in a way her voice almost never was. "You ruined everything," she said. And then to Mary, with a fierceness that was almost grief. "You ruined everything." Min-Jae turned to look at her then. Really look, for the first time in that room. And what he said was quiet and without cruelty, which was perhaps the kindest and most devastating thing he could have said. Sujin. Just her name. The whole sentence was in it. She understood. She had understood, probably for months. He turned back to Mary. He crossed the room. He did not hurry. He reached the bed, and he did something that no one in that room, not Chinidu, not the doctor, not the investigator, not Sujin, expected. He lowered himself to one knee beside her bed. The way you lower yourself beside something precious and fragile and irreplaceable. He reached out and placed one hand, very gently, on the swell of her stomach. Mary's face crumpled. The composure. All that months-long, ocean-crossing, apartment-sharing, restaurant-managing composure. Finally, completely gave way. "You should have told me," he said. His voice was a murmur. "Just for her. You were marrying someone else." Her voice came through tears. "You had already left. You made that very clear." "I was wrong." He said it without hesitation. Without qualification. "I was wrong and I ran from the only real thing I had found and I have been wrong every day since." He looked up at her. His eyes were the same as they had always been, dark, focused, telling her everything and nothing. "I have been looking for you for 6 months. You had me blocked. My assistant." He closed his eyes briefly. "Mary. I did not know. I did not know any of this. But I am here now, and I need you to hear me." He took her hand in both of his. "I will cancel the wedding." Sujin made a sound. It might have been a laugh. It might have been something else. "Min-Jae," she began. "I am sorry," he said to her, and he meant it, she could tell. The particular sorrow of a man who has failed to be honest in time. "I am sorry. But this." He looked back at Mary, at the hand he was holding, at the evidence of everything that had happened while he had been standing in his 40-floor building looking out at a city that wasn't telling him what he needed to know. "This is not something I can walk away from." Sujin stood very straight for a long moment. Then she picked up her bag from the chair where she had placed it, straightened her blouse, and walked out of the room with her head high. The investigator and the clinic woman followed. The door closed behind them. Chinidu picked up his paper coffee cup, looked at it, looked at Min-Jae kneeling beside Mary's bed, and very quietly moved to the corner of the room by the window, where he stood with his back very slightly turned, giving them the only privacy the room could offer. The monitoring machine beeped. Steadily. The heartbeat. Strong and regular and insistent. Min-Jae's hand tightened on Mary's. "My child," he said softly, almost to himself, testing the words, the weight of them, the vast reality of what they contained. "My child will never grow up without me." He looked up at Mary. I promise you that. She looked at him. Through her tears, through her exhaustion, through 6 months of solitude and discipline, and the particular heroism of a woman who had decided to carry something enormous alone because she could not afford to believe in anything else. She looked at him, and she saw the same thing she had seen on the stone bench by the Han River in the rain. The real person. The one behind the building and the title, and the 42 floors. You have a great deal to answer for, she said. I know. An extraordinary amount, actually. I know. A pause. Okay, she said. Small and exhausted and true. The monitoring machine beeped. The city moved outside the window. 10 million people going about their lives, unbothered and unknowing. And in room 412 of Seoul National Hospital, in the particular, impossible way that some things begin, not cleanly, not simply, not without wreckage, something else did too. Sometimes love arrives when life feels impossible. Sometimes it arrives with a heartbeat. And sometimes it takes 6 months of hiding, an ocean of pride, a delivery room full of shock, and one man on his knees before the truth finally gets to be told out loud. This was Mary's story. It is not finished. The baby has not yet arrived, the wedding has not yet been officially cancelled, and Sujin's car is still in the hospital parking lot because she has not yet started the engine. There is still so much left to happen. But you were here for this part. And that matters. If this story moved you, if you felt your heart in your throat at that delivery room door, if you held your breath when he walked into room 412, if you smiled through your tears when he got down on his knee, then this channel is your home. Subscribe to Oyinelle AfroKorean Romance right now. And drop your country in the comments. We are genuinely asking, because this story is reaching corners of the world we want to know about. Tell us what you loved. Tell us the moment that got you. Like this video, share it with someone who needs a story today, and come back, because Mary and Min-Jae are not done yet. Not even close.